Hello and welcome to the Deckbuilders buffet here at MTG Another Look. These card suggestion videos are like a buffet where you try a little of this, a little of that, and leave behind the cards that don't work for you. With that said, grab a plate and let's take another look at some commander cards that you might be missing out on. Let's talk about As Foretold from Amonkhet. It's an enchantment that costs 2 and a blue. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a time counter on As Foretold. Once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a spell you cast with mana value X or less, where X is the number of time counters on As Foretold. As Foretold is a card that has seen play in some Eternal formats alongside the Suspend cards without a mana cost. For just the 3 mana to cast As Foretold, you can immediately cast a spell with a mana cost of 0, or without a mana cost for free the same turn. Being able to cast an Ancestral Vision or Inevitable Betrayal for free on turn 3 is a very fast and dangerous capability. It can help you to make the fair versions of unfair old cards play in those unfair ways that the Suspend nerf was intended to avoid. Getting a free Profane Tutor or a Gaia's Will to go off without waiting can put you way ahead of the rest of the table. And that's just the capabilities that As Foretold gives you on the first turn it's played. As turn cycles continue to pass, As Foretold can play like a more powerful version of Aether Vial. Aether Vial is another card that has historically seen tons of competitive play. It allows you to cheat creatures into play at instant speed and avoid counterspells, the latter of which doesn't apply to As Foretold. But both of these permanents also provide you huge amounts of mana and tempo advantage. Putting a 2-drop into play with Aether Vial without tapping any mana to pay for it essentially ramped you 2 mana and at a quick pace. And casting spells that cost progressively higher amounts of mana with As Foretold can save you several mana over the course of a few early turns. As Foretold also has the important wording of allowing you to play spells with mana values equal to or lesser than the number of counters on it. Aether Vial requires the mana value equal the number of counters. Playing with Aether Vial required some tough decision making in some situations to determine if you wanted to add a counter to it or not. Adding a third counter to the vial means you can never cheat a 2-drop into play with it again. So As Foretold translates a little better to the singleton nature of Commander, as it comes with the flexibility of being able to cast any cheaper spell, or a spell whose mana value matches the number of counters on it. Some other very interesting wording on As Foretold allows the spell you want to be cast for free from anywhere. It does not specify from your hand. Let's say you have it combined with something like Kess Dissident Mage. Kess allows you to cast instants and sorceries from your graveyard once each of your turns. As Foretold allows you to pay 0 for those spells instead if their mana value is less than or equal to the number of counters on it. So you can cast spells from your graveyard by paying 0 with that combination of cards. A card like Ignite the Future will also receive its bonus because it was cast from a graveyard. It doesn't require that it be cast with its flashback cost, just that it be cast from a graveyard. And only requiring 4 As Foretold counters makes the scenario not that far-fetched. You can also cast spells for free from exile, like if it were exiled with a Bonehorde Dracosaur. It also lets you play your commander for free. The first time at least. Each time you cast your commander from the command zone after that, you have to pay any additional costs, which includes the commander tax. If you were casting Kess from the command zone for the second time with the As Foretold discount, you'd end up paying only 2 for the commander tax. The actual Kess part of the spell would be free, but you'd pay 2 for each time you've played your commander from the command zone this game. That's still a hefty discount. You get to replay your commander each turn with the entire mana value discounted. Having to pay 2 instead of 6 is a huge savings in mana, and can determine whether you can cast it again or not at all. Another thing to notice is that As Foretold allows you to cast a spell for free on each turn, not each of your turns. That means on each of your opponent's turns you can cast an instant for free as long as it meets the requirement of the counters. As Foretold can cast you 4 free spells per turn cycle. That's absurd. In decks that draw a lot of cards and play a lot of low mana value instants, you can be getting 2 to 8 mana worth of free spells on top of whatever you can pay for. If you compare this to something like Seedborn Muse that allows tons of extra spells to be cast each turn cycle, as long as they're at instant speed, you can see the value possible. Seedborn Muse is a highly respected card in Commander, and often an expensive one. As Foretold, in the right builds, can provide similarly disgusting amounts of free value. You can also think of As Foretold as a ramp piece, Once it gets a couple of counters on it, it's almost like it's ramping you as much as the spells you cast for free cost. If you're able to cast a 2-drop and a 3-drop off of As Foretold, it's like As Foretold provided you with 5 mana you wouldn't have had otherwise. As Foretold has seen a boost in play lately with Obeka Splitter of Seconds, the recent powerful commander from Thunder Junction. It enables a lot of the free suspend cards that synergize with extra upkeeps. It fits very well there. But I think As Foretold belongs in a large variety of other decks as well. It can enable commanders that care about casting multiple spells in a single turn. Eris Roar the Storm will create powerful flyers each turn, and As Foretold can help you to afford to cast multiple spells per turn when one is free. In any decks that might want a Seedborn Muse, like Rashmi Eternity's Crafter, As Foretold can put in work as well. A deck like this really wants to cast a spell on each of its opponent's turns, and will often have a good mana curve and extra cards in hand because of Rashmi's ability. Give As Foretold a shot outside of decks that are obvious. Next, let's talk about Rapid Vigor, originally printed in Future Sight. It's an instant that costs 1 and a green, and regenerates each creature you control. Rapid Vigor is a great budget option and/or a great redundancy for your heroic intervention. While it doesn't provide hexproof or indestructibility, a one-time regeneration effect for your entire team can do a pretty good impersonation. Heroic Intervention can be used to prevent targeted effects by granting hexproof, but I would say most of the time only one creature is going to be targeted by a spell. Unless you're playing against a Hinata deck, spells that will target all of your creatures are pretty rare. The indestructibility Heroic Intervention provides does almost the same thing that Regeneration would do. Regeneration prevents a creature from being destroyed or losing creatures from combat damage. Indestructibility also prevents destruction and losing creatures from combat damage. Granted, indestructibility will last until end of turn, while regeneration will only prevent one instance of being destroyed. It's theoretically possible you can regenerate your creature, prevent its untimely demise once, and then have it be targeted by a removal spell again in the same turn. It's a bit more unlikely, but that is another fringe benefit Heroic Intervention has over Rapid Vigor. Both spells are unable to help you in situations where an opponent is using a -X/-X effect, exiling, or bouncing your creatures. And most of the time, Heroic Intervention is used as protection from a board wipe. In those situations in which Heroic Intervention is most used, Rapid Vigor will do the same thing. It'll prevent your team from being destroyed directly, or by things like Blasphemous Act. If you're on a budget, Rapid Vigor is a great substitution for Heroic Intervention. And if you're in a mono-green deck like Yorvo, Lord of Garenbrig, you're going to want multiple copies of your Scant Protection spells. Rapid Vigor is cute in combination with Ruxa, Patient Professor, because it doesn't grant any abilities to your creatures. It will regenerate them and protect them from being destroyed, but it won't give them abilities like Indestructible, allowing them to keep any buffs they get from being vanilla creatures. It can also protect creatures like Grothama All-Devouring that you want to be fighting constantly. Rapid Vigor can be important to allow you to draw cards and keep your creatures when you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Next up is Showstopping Surprise from the Karlov Manor Commander decks. It's an instant that costs 3 and 2 red and says, choose target creature you control. Turn it face up if it's face down. Then it deals damage equal to its power to each other creature. Showstopping Surprise is like Chandra's Ignition at home. It also costs dramatically less monetarily. Despite reprints, Chandra's Ignition stays in the $10 range or above. It's an amazing budget option for being able to deal absurd amounts of damage to all other creatures. It doesn't hit opponents like Chandra's Ignition, so it's not a finisher or an I win button, but it can fill the same role as a board wipe that keeps one of your creatures around, and it can do it at instant speed. Cards that can clear the board and allow your attacker or attackers to strike at your opponents unhindered are very valuable. This is the kind of card that can turn the tides of a game and knock out a player on the spot. Showstopping Surprise can combo with Toralf, God of Fury to deal excess amounts of damage to many different creatures, and then deal it to opponents. Toralf plus Showstopping Surprise can knock multiple players out easily on a full board. It obviously combines well with any face-down Matters commander, since that was what it was made for. It can go great in Missy, flipping over a beneficial face-down creature and then destroying your opponent's creatures, and turning them into your own tutus. It also works great in decks that care about high powers, like Zayatora the Incinerator. It can ensure that it's an instant speed board wipe that can leave at least one creature free to attack, since your creatures will be bigger than your opponent's. Trickbind is another interesting card I want to talk about. Trickbind is an instant for 1 and a blue. It has split second, which means as long as this spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. Counter target activated or triggered ability. If a permanent's ability is countered this way, activated abilities of that permanent can't be activated this turn. Mana abilities can't be targeted. Stifle effects are pretty rare in Commander. They have sometimes seen play in Eternal formats, usually in Legacy, and usually the original Stifle that the entire class of cards is most known for. Stifle effects in Commander usually are thought of as too situational and not impactful enough because they're usually one-time effects. In a lot of situations, if you stifle an important activated or triggered ability, the player whose permanent you targeted can either just reactivate it again the same turn, or activate the ability next turn cycle. You've used a card and not destroyed or otherwise removed their card. There are some very impactful activated and triggered abilities that are definitely worth you trading a card to stop. An activation from Aetherflux Reservoir or a Door to Nothingness is something that is definitely worth throwing a card away to prevent. But there are some permanents with very impactful abilities that can be used repeatedly in a turn. If you're playing against an Aristocrats player that is going to sacrifice all their creatures in response to an exile-based Wrath to keep their creatures in the graveyard, where they can return them later, you can target their Worn Soul Trader's sacrifice ability the first time, they won't get the treasure, and they won't be able to activate it anymore for the rest of the turn, and they can't activate any non-mana abilities in response, since Trickbind has split second. Coma Cosmos Serpent is another permanent that's very difficult to remove because after the first couple turns, it has a handful of tokens to either attack you with or to sacrifice to give Coma indestructible. Trickbind can counter the first activation, preventing it from gaining indestructible, and prevent it from activating again, giving you the opportunity to destroy it. Only a couple Stifle effects do anything similar. Interdict and Tishana's Tidebinder are two of the other options that can prevent repeated activation on that same turn or in the future, but both are limited in which activated abilities you can target, and neither have split second. Split second can get you out of those situations, like with Coma, where they can activate the ability again in response to you trying to counter the first instance of the activation. Interdict and Tishana's Tidebinder are both great cards. The Tidebinder can act as a kind of removal for a creature or a commander, making them a much less useful vanilla creature. And Interdict cantrips, which is very valuable on spells that you may be dubious spending an entire card on. Now it replaces itself. Trickbind would be an interesting inclusion in Lier, Disciple of the Drowned, which can give double life to your instants and sorceries. Lier prevents spells from being countered, but doesn't say anything about abilities. You can snipe important abilities and do it twice while not being a non-bow with the commander. Trickbind is a good option for any kind of control-y or spellslinger builds. You can include it in Tower and Sky Summoner to give you some interaction with abilities, which are very difficult to interact with, and make your Drake token off of it. It can also work in Marchesa, Dealer of Death, which will trigger when you use your Trickbind on an opponent's ability. The way Split Second works is that Marchesa's triggered ability will still trigger, you can pay the one to get your card, and no one can activate its spells or abilities in response still, while Trickbind is on the stack. The last card I want to talk about is a quick one. It's Phyrexian Etchings from Cold Snap. It's an enchantment that costs 3 black with a cumulative upkeep of a black mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an age counter on this permanent, then sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. At the beginning of your end step, draw a card for each age counter on Phyrexian Etchings. When Phyrexian Etchings is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you lose 2 life for each age counter on it. This is a very budget version of Necropotence and the other knockoffs. Typically, these types of effects are very expensive monetarily, so this one costing a quarter is a fun but worse alternative. You do have to pay some mana each of your upkeeps to keep it in play, but when you do, it's like a Phyrexian Arena that scales for extra cards each turn. It's not an amazing card, but it can give you a lot of devotion to black, and in those traditional big mana black decks, creating huge amounts of extra mana isn't much of a problem. Cryptghast and Nirkana Revenant are commonly played and cost a little under $5 each now. They'll help you keep the enchantment on the battlefield for a long time with minimal trouble. If you want lots of redundancy or a cheap version of these draw effects, Phyrexian Etchings is an option. These black decks also tend to gain tons of life in one fell swing, with things like Consuming Corruption and Exsanguinate to offset the life loss if the enchantment does leave the battlefield. Also, exiling or bouncing the etchings will not cause you to lose the life. So if you ever need to reset the card and don't want to lose life, that's a way out of the contract. Phyrexian Etchings works with creatures that care about drawing cards, like Sheoldred the Apocalypse. It's a good devotion enabler for something like Erebos God of the Dead, and can actually be donated to an opponent with lots of counters with Blim Comedic Genius. Thank you for watching, everybody. What do you think about the cards we discussed today? Are these cards diamonds in the rough, or just more rough? Are there any cards you think are hidden gems? Let me know in the comments down below, and give the video a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I will see you next time, and have a great rest of your day.